Today we're going to be talking about Descartes' argument, cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. We're going to be analyzing the argument, talking about possible ways that it could be wrong. Could it be that we know a lot more than this, or could it be that we don't even know that we exist?
All right. So cogito ergo sum. Seems like Descartes, like many people, was having maybe a kind of midlife crisis and decided that he wanted to throw away all prior assumptions and beliefs about himself, the world, God, everything, and see if anything that he thought was true and was building his entire life upon was actually true or not. So in order to do this, his idea was to throw away every single assumption possible, and including even like the very basics, like, am I a human? Do I exist? Does anything around me exist? Am I even sitting at this table right here, right now? And that was kind of his starting point, right? As a basic summary. And then if you get there to a point of just blankness, it's kind of a question of if you can know anything at all without relying on a bunch of assumptions, like assuming that your senses are actually accurate to reality outside of you, or assuming that there isn't some evil trickster just trying to fool you with every single logical process. And what he finally gets to is this idea that no matter what's going on, even if there's like some evil devil manipulating all of his senses, manipulating all of his thoughts, the one thing that nobody could ever do to trick him, or the one thing that couldn't be false, is he himself must exist in some form. Basically, the argument is, I know that even if everything else is false, I'm thinking, and therefore something must be doing the thinking, even if it's not a body, even if it's not what I think of as myself. This thinking is occurring, and I know that because I'm even asking the question, therefore I exist. I think it's important to note that Descartes goes on in this series of meditations to, after reaching this insight, he goes on to like make a bunch of assumptions about, he's thinking and he has a thought or a concept of a God, and that concept is perfect, and therefore like something must have caused it, and it couldn't be a bad God because, well, I don't know, he does some jumping around that. But basically he goes on to say that he's proven that everything that he observes is true, but most philosophers just kind of throw it out after the first and second meditations. And so that's what we'll be doing here as well.
Yeah, and I'm also just gonna quibble with the first and second meditations as well.
Yeah, we know that you have some quibbles. We'll talk about your quibbles maybe a little bit.
I mean, so maybe we can talk about Nietzsche's argument about will to power in that other essay, Monte. He talks about how Nietzsche says that the actual cause of the thought happening is because the will to power, which is this, kind of general, all-encompassing life force, is actually the thing that's causing the thought to occur. The I is sort of a fiction, which is like like this artificial projection of the will to power, whereas the actual cause is not the I. The actual cause is this will to power thing. So I think that's kind of a strange argument, but it's at least a way for us to talk about how I exist might not necessarily follow from I think.
I do think that Nietzsche's argument is kind of strange, like bringing the will to power into it, but I guess that's his framework. But I don't think that thinking necessarily implies an I. I mean, it implies a something logically, because the thinking is happening, or something that appears to be thinking. is happening. But I don't think that it's helpful for us to use the term I to describe that something, because I think that that has all kinds of implications and connotations when we use that word. But I also don't think that Descartes would have necessarily even disagreed with that position, like in his following up from like the first and second meditations. I don't think that the I was the important point there.
Can you give an example of what it would be like if something was thinking or something was happening, but there was no I?
Sure. Well, it depends on how you define the term I. We could imagine a process that creates that creates like some kind of a loop that I guess gives the illusion of perceiving itself as an I. I mean, maybe that would be considered an I, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a being with will or an independent personality or something like that. It could just be some process that's giving the illusion of a personality from within itself.
I mean, we could talk about animals. Like, clearly animals have some kind of experience, right? But they don't necessarily have the thought, I am thinking these things.
Mm-hmm. No, but I mean, Descartes not saying they don't exist, he's not really saying, it's not really a question about what exists or what doesn't exist. It's a question of what you can know exists or doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Animals don't really have that question of trying to figure out what exists and what doesn't. Presumably. Sorry, Katie, go ahead.
Presumably. I was just going to say, I don't know if I can give an example of where there would be thinking and there is no I. It really just depends on how concrete is your definition of an I. The reason why I don't like to use the word I in this statement, or why I take a little bit of an issue with the cogito ergo sum and the way that it's worded, is because I think that it might allow people to get sidetracked on the I part.
Well, yeah, and I agree with that. I do think that your sort of fundamental axiom, which is that something is happening, like I'm observing things happening and therefore something is happening. Right. And I think that animals are a good argument as to which provides support to your statement, which is that, I think maybe you can get hung up on the word I because, maybe things can happen without there necessarily being an I.
How do animals support that?
Because animals don't have an ego, or at least not all of them do. Maybe some of them do, but clearly there are lower and lower forms of life that have some kind of experience, presumably, but they don't have an identity. They don't have a sense of, oh, this is me thinking this thing.
But I mean, presumably though, a lot of animals have like a subjectivity. And if they have a subjectivity, you could argue that an ego is just like an off growth of that, or it allows it to be like formalized in words.
You certainly could. I'm not taking issue with that. I mean, a lot of people would define an I just as a subjectivity, but the thing is that I is not a very universally defined concept. So it can add controversy into the I think therefore I am argument that doesn't need to be there.
So I hope this doesn't derail things, but another argument as to the invalidity of I think therefore I am is given by Alan Watts in his book on the Tao, where he talks about, just because something is happening doesn't mean that there necessarily is a thing. Just because there is an object does not mean that there is a subject. So for instance, and he talks about this as being literally a linguistic difference between Western languages and Eastern languages. And specifically in Chinese, there's like a word for raining or something like that. And it doesn't even occur to Eastern people that there needs to be a subject there, which is observing the object. It's raining. There's no subject. There's only an object.
Just raining, not it's
Yeah,
raining.
yeah.
Except
Like
for-
literally, literally translated, the sentence would just be raining.
Right. So that's an interesting point.
rains.
Okay, imagine, we can't really express it in English, but I'm curious about this with you, Chris, because you reject I think, therefore I am. But do you reject something? Imagine if we could express it in Chinese, if maybe it works this way. There's a statement like am. Would you say that that is unprovable or requires assumptions, or that it is actually observable in a different form of truth that doesn't require?
I would say that it is outside the purview of my experience to know what that statement being false would mean. That doesn't mean that the statement is not false.
Can we clarify what statement we're talking about?
This sort of something is happening.
So I think therefore, I think therefore am, or I think therefore something's happening.
It's a difficult statement to clarify, because what we're trying to get at is the fact that in English, sentences need to be constructed with a subject. Like, I think therefore I am, or something is happening. Whereas more what we're trying to get across is just the assertion, like we could frame it as that something is happening, but really just like really base, like occurrence happening, like not implying any kind of subject with any kind of details about it, but just the absence of nothingness. Am.
Yeah, and like and another person who talks about this, Jordan Peterson, connecting it to religion and God and all that. I mean, if you look at Yahweh, the word for God in Hebrew, it just means I am, or more accurately, just am. And so basically your question, do you accept am? That is the fundamental question. Does existence exist? And once you accept that as your axiom, basically you can derive whatever you want. You can derive that God exists, whatever. But that is the fundamental axiom of. Basically, you have to say yes to that axiom, and then you can share in this experience that everybody seems to be sharing in.
So for me, I say yes to am, and Descartes helped me get to am, and I kind of threw away the I think therefore, because I didn't think it was interesting or what he was really trying to get at. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, in his meditations, he does go on to like prove a whole bunch of things based on the I. But I think that the interesting insight there that I do think is a real insight is that if you're experiencing your own perspective and asking this question, is there existence? It's like the fundamental baseline am, is that valid? Then I accept that the fact that you are asking that question proves the validity of that statement. And you said that it's outside of your frame of reference or outside of your knowledge to imagine how that could be false. But I guess that's true. It's outside of my frame of reference to imagine how that could be false. But I think that means that it's true.
Well, yes.
I don't see how you can argue it against it.
Because our experience is limited. So just because our own experience provides no anomalies that would throw our model into question does not mean that we will never encounter any anomalies that will throw our model into question.
But that's not really what Katie's saying, though. Like, Katie's not arguing for a model without anomaly or anything like that. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, that the basic argument being made here is that because there's a subjective experience taking place, there must be something happening in existence.
Yeah. I mean, a subjective experience taking place is a something.
And what I'm saying is that is an axiom that you must say yes to in order to get to any of the other parts of the system. If you say no to that, it's kind of like Hamlet says, to be or not to be. You can just decide that nothing exists. And that's your system. You're required to say yes to existence, and then everything else follows from that.
But I don't think anything else follows from that. I think it's just the only thing that we can know. And I don't think that
that's
we're
a different
required.
argument.
Yeah.
We can talk about that.
Sure.
Yeah. So I agree with you, but that, you have to assume that, and then you also have to assume some other things to get to kind of this common space where human beings are interacting on common footing.
Right. I mean, I don't necessarily see that. I think the argument Katie's making is that it's not an assumption. It's just it's almost just stating a definition to say
those are the same thing.
No, it's not an assumption, and it's not a stating of a definition. It's just a
self-evident truth.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just saying, you sound like a religious person. This truth is self-evident.
Well, Chris, I don't see how without contradiction you can argue that we could be having a subjective experience and nothing exists.
Just because I can't imagine how it would happen doesn't mean that it's impossible.
I mean, this is by definition not nothing. Like, even if everything is an illusion and you don't really exist and this room doesn't really exist and my body doesn't really exist, there's still an experience taking place in this moment, which is by definition not nothing.
Yes, but because you've defined it that way. This is not nothing. Therefore, this is not nothing.
Sure.
No, but it's
not a logical argument.
It is a logical argument. But I mean, I'm not just making up words. It's not like, the word nothing is like the word unicorn, and I've decided, it's a concept. The word nothing refers to a concept. The concept is the concept of nothing, the concept of the absence of everything. By definition, me having an experience is not the absence of everything.
How do you know?
Well, it's the definition. It's the definition. It's creating a definition. It's imagining different scenarios, and we're creating words to distinguish between two possible scenarios. And we're saying that it's definitely not this scenario. And we know that because if it were this scenario, we wouldn't even be able to come up with a definition.
Okay, that's an axiom that you're assuming to be true.
I don't think we're going to agree, but I think that it might be interesting to see if maybe we could, if we assumed these axioms to be true, could we build anything else on them?
Of course. We could add more axioms. So I think there are some fundamental axioms of sort of life or existence or whatever this is, right? That like we have to accept as true. And that just by virtue of us all being humans, we all have to agree that they're true. But that doesn't make them sort of absolute truths. It just makes them maybe further along the spectrum of truth than other things.
I agree with you for everything except for the one truth of existence itself. Ariel and I perceive I think a fundamental difference between that axiom and every other, because you don't need to make any assumptions for it. You're just deriving a statement based on existence itself. You could strip away really everything, and it was like really everything, and it would still be there. But I do agree with you that in order to get by in day-to-day life, like there's other assumptions that we make and build in order to interact with each other.
I mean, I guess, Chris, like in my mind, I'm like following what could possibly be a train of logic for your argument. And it seems like you could have, like you basically have to, I would say, how can I be having an experience if nothing exists? And you would say, well, I'd say like that's a contradiction. And you would say, well, contradiction is fine. You're just making the assumption that we can't have contradiction. And I would say even contradiction is something. And you would say that's just an assumption you're making.
Well, so my overall point is that in order to have a logical conversation requires there to be a logical framework. And in order for there to be a logical framework requires there to be axioms of the logical framework from which all of the other theorems of the logical framework can be derived.
Except I think the power of this argument that I'm having an experience, therefore something exists. The power of that argument is that it's prior to, like Katie, the point Katie made last time, it's prior to logic and language. All it requires is the immediate experience itself. All it requires is experience itself. And that experience itself leads directly to knowledge of experience. You don't even need logic.
Well, but what I'm saying is you need to say yes to that. You need to believe it's true.
Even if I don't believe it's true, it's still happening.
I mean, if you don't believe that you exist, then what does that even mean? That it's still happening? Like,
but the argument isn't based on me being sane or believing I exist. It's just based on me having an experience, which occurs whether or not. If I'm completely in denial and I'm completely like convinced that nothing exists or that I don't exist, then yeah, I would be someone who doesn't know that I exist, I guess. But I'm saying,
yeah, exactly.
But that's not necessary for the argument to work. I'm just saying I can know that something exists because I am having an experience.
Because
I
yes.
get what you're saying. So you're saying that
because you've accepted that as an axiom of your system.
So you're saying that the inference requires sanity, and therefore it's not prior to logic.
I don't think it's saying that.
The inference requires sanity.
Because there's an experience, and then there's the idea, the knowledge that I exist. And so you're saying that the step to get there requires logic.
Yeah, well, it requires logic, or it requires some axiom which defines it to be true.
Do we even have to get there in order to talk about existence?
I mean, if we here's the thing, if we don't all share this axiom, then we can't actually be having this conversation. So, you know, the fact that we're having this conversation, we've all agreed to be here and have this conversation, is evidence that we all accept this axiom as true. It is not evidence of the truth of the axiom. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, because
I'm saying we're defining it to be true, not that it is true.
Chris, stop. Because if you're saying that the fact that we're having this conversation is evidence that we've defined something to be true, the definition, if you're saying that it's evidence that we've just defined something to be true, the fact that we've defined something is like a narrower and category of something happening that takes way more assumptions than what I'm asserting.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not saying that it is true. I'm saying it's evidence that it's true. Sure. But that doesn't mean it is true.
Chris, can you maybe as an experiment try rephrasing Katie's argument and try steel manning it?
Can you restate your argument, Katie?
The whole argument?
No, I want Chris to do it. No, just this argument that something exists. The argument that something exists.
I mean, the argument seems to be we observe things, or things seem to be happening, and we can't imagine what it would even mean for things not to be happening, since they do seem to be happening. Therefore, it is true that something is happening. Does that sound right?
I don't think that's quite right. But it was a good attempt. I think the argument is more that I personally am having an experience. Whoever the subject is having an experience. And we don't know how real or not real that experience is. All the specific somethings that I'm experiencing could be completely false. But because there is an experience, something in the universe must exist. Even if I'm just like, I don't know, a positron blinking into the existence and then blinking out of it in like a thousandth of a nanosecond, something must be happening.
I mean, I think I understand what you're saying, but in order to reduce it down to, and basically what you're saying is there is some kind of truth. And the truth is connected to the fact that I'm observing something is happening. And even if my experience can't be connected to anything else, it still exists as its own sort of self-contained universe or whatever.
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Truth is a tricky word. What's difficult about this argument for me in trying to express it to other people, and like I think that you guys are getting it, but it's tough because every word that we could use to describe it, like truth, knowledge, existence, I, self, every word that I can think of in English has a lot more packed into it than what I'm trying to say.
Exactly. Those are the definitions that we have to agree on in order for us to have a conversation.
Well, we can imagine a statement that's much more base than our words would allow. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
I'm not sure I understand that last point.
I don't know. I don't know if it's really understandable. What I'm trying to say is that if I frame the argument in such a way like, okay, I am thinking and I am having an experience and therefore something must be happening, all of those words have way more assumptions built into them than what I'm actually trying to say. Because if I say I am thinking, then that's implying a self and an I, cognitive processes, and that's not what I'm trying to do, but I don't have a better
Oh, okay. I think
So that's why I boiled it down just to am at that one point, but even maybe that's too much.
I think I understand what you're saying. You're saying that basically the process of communicating these thoughts in words requires them to have a much higher appearance of rigorousness than they actually have. So if you could somehow communicate this thought to me without using words, if you could just kind of think it at me, then it would be a lot more rigorous, and we'd agree a lot more or something.
Right. I think if we could just think it at each other, it would be pretty undeniable.
Yeah, I think you're right. And at the same time, I think that's exactly what religious people talk about when they discuss the existence of God.
So I recognize that this does sound extremely religious. However, I think that it's different because religious axioms are generally way bigger. They'll say that like God is self-evident because look at existence and God is existence. And then they'll hand you a book which has a bunch of very specific stories in it.
Right,
like,
exactly. And then therefore this whole book is true.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely some more assumptions that are built on top of that base assumption.
Right. So you could say that this sounds religious, and maybe it is. Like maybe we could call the existence or whatever God if you wanted to give a more exciting flavor to it. But that's not what I'm trying to do.
Okay. And so my point is just that if you define God as this concept that we're trying to communicate, then I think it's undeniable that God exists.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're saying.
And honestly, and I think that the I could just as easily be God as it could be I, you know. Well, okay. If you define God as existence, which a lot of spiritual people do, then it's basically the same. But the thing is that when you define God as existence, then usually I find that the reason why people are doing that isn't because they just think that God is a better definition for a very simple assumptionless form of existence. They're doing it because if they say that existence is God, then they get a really good feeling when they assert that existence exists. And it usually has a whole bunch of other connotations that are much more fantastical and exciting.
Yeah, and I think you can get somewhere when you say, okay, assumption number one, there appears to be some experience which is happening, which appears to be occurring through my senses. And number two, if I trust the information that seems to be occurring and coming in through my senses, then I'm a much happier person. Then number three, it makes me happy to say that these things exist and are actually, basically it makes me happy to trust the information that is happening. And therefore, I'm going to act as though that information is accurate.
Yeah, that's totally different though. That's way beyond what I'm trying to say. Like, I think you can get somewhere with that, but that's totally not where I've been trying to go.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that like all of logic is based on one axiom or another. And you can either define the axiom to be true, or you can have faith that it's true, which I think they kind of,
or you can, there's one
like one's a stronger version of the other, I think.
No, but the axiom of existence is just observably true, not based on faith. It's just, I know this sounds very religious and woo-woo, but it's just true. It's whether you put an I into it, whether you have definitions in it, whether you, I don't know, like any layer that you try to strip away, there's still a something.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that if you arrive at a statement like that cannot be logically proven, you have arrived at the axiom, and the axiom is not provable. The axiom is defined as true.
No, but
that's why it's true.
It's provable to yourself.
Can you elaborate?
It's provable from within your own self. Well, okay, it's provable from within myself, and there's the problem of other minds. But for the purposes of this argument, I'm just assuming that you guys have minds similar to my own, and if you do, then it's provable to yourselves from within yourselves also. Maybe it's not provable.
Yeah, I mean, basically but you're not claiming anything special. You're claiming, okay, basically I can prove the axiom of the system from within the system, which, well, first of all, you can't, but you can assume the axiom. You can say this thing is true because it's true, because I have defined it as true.
Yeah, but Chris, like the subjective experience isn't an axiom.
Yeah.
It's a piece of it. It's an experience.
So I think maybe the part where we're running into trouble is there's a difference between the sort of the unconscious processes or the intuitive processes or the emotional processes, all of which seem to be kind of related, but maybe different things, and our ego, our conscious understanding of what's happening. So even if, I guess when I say this is an axiom of the system, this is defined to be true. What I don't necessarily mean is we have consciously defined it to be true. What I'm saying is that our brain has somehow unconsciously defined it as true. And so when our conscious mind looks at the system, to our conscious mind, it appears that, oh, this is just a self-evident truth of the system. But what we don't realize is that unconsciously, we've assumed that thing to be true, and that's why it appears to be true to our conscious mind.
All of those statements would only be possible within the context of existence.
Yeah, of course. I've already said that this conversation wouldn't happen without all of us having that axiom.
I mean, Chris, like, do you realize though that like your own, like, what do you view of like your own status of the things you're saying? Like when you say you can't know anything for sure and everything is axioms, and at the base everything is axioms, and even experience are axioms, like you realize like that's all, I guess it's not so much a problem for you. You can just say everything is axiomatic for you.
Well, everything is derived from axioms. One of my axioms, though, is that logic exists and causality exists.
Okay. Here's maybe where I can. Sorry, I need to interrupt because I finally have like an answer to how you can prove it within yourself, but we can't talk about it. Experience is not an axiom. Like the experience of having an experience is not an axiom. It's a something. It's pre-axiomatic. But anytime,
how do you know?
Anytime you would talk about it, you are making statements about it, which is then it kind of becomes axiomatic. Like any statement that we could make about it would be a logical statement, but the thing itself is not a statement.
Well, maybe. I mean, so either it's fundamentally true that my experience is happening, or it's an axiom of my system, and I've defined it to be true. But regardless, I actually can't distinguish between those two things. And actually, this is the point of that other.
Could you see, though, how in either of those scenarios, something exists?
In the second scenario, where it's just something that I've defined to be true.
In both scenarios, something is happening.
Well, okay, I guess I can accept that, but what?
We don't know what. All we know is that something's happening.
That's the only thing we've been trying to say this whole time.
I mean, but here's the thing is I don't know the difference between whether that statement is actually true or whether I've defined it to be true unconsciously. So it almost doesn't even matter, you know? Like you guys are quibbling over that difference. Like, oh no, it absolutely is true. And I'm just saying, well, it might not be. It might be, you know, just that I've unconsciously defined it as true. And you're saying, well,
we're not quibbling.
I think there are actually other failure modes. I mean, so the reason Ariel, why your challenge is invalid is because I think there are other failure modes. Like they're like, if nothing exists and nothing is happening, then how can we say anything about anything? That's my point.
If nothing exists and nothing were happening, there wouldn't be an experience occurring.
How do you know? How do you know what existence even means?
I don't know what it means.
Yeah, you have like an intuition about what it means
I just
based on your experience.
I just know it's not nothing.
All right. Actually, this ties really well into, you know, what was it? So the anti-realist perspective is that best opinion and truth are inconceivable, and therefore, what's the point of talking about truth if best opinion is indistinguishable from truth? And I kind of agree with that. And also, he later makes the argument that anti-realists are saying that that best opinion should actually be valued higher than truth, which I disagree with. I think that you can still value truth even though you recognize that it's a moving target. You can still try to hit the target even though basically the target might not exist.
Yeah. No, this is good because it kind of leads into the third question I wanted to talk about, which was what stance do we take towards like conventional reality as we experience it, given this like argument from skepticism?
Yeah, so basically, since my best opinion, my best model for how reality works is indistinguishable to me from how reality actually works, my best opinion on how things work is indistinguishable from the truth, except in retrospect. Okay, so if I have an opinion about how things work and there's some anomaly which my opinion on things doesn't explain, then I know that the truth and my previous best opinion are actually different things. At that point, they become distinguishable. So basically, I treat my best opinion as truth until there's an anomaly. And then I have to, if I accept the anomaly as true, I must accept that my current model of the universe is insufficient.
Okay, well, here's my question to you. Like, how do you define best opinion? Or how do you rank order different opinions, given this, like, radical skepticism? How do you determine what best opinion is? How do you rank order different opinions and say that one opinion is better than another, given this radical skepticism?
Whatever appears to have no anomalies, whatever appears to explain all empirical observations up to this point. Basically, I appear to have this memory, and this timeline of things that have happened since I started having a memory, which is when I was, a couple of years old, maybe. And if my model of the universe explains all of the empirical phenomena that I've observed since then I'm cool trusting, basically I'm cool trusting my model of the universe. I'm cool trusting that it will continue working.
So you're taking as an axiom that a better opinion is one that has fewer anomalies.
Correct. Yeah. So while we can't be certain on the absolute truth of anything, I do think that we can point to some things which are more true than others, given a certain logical framework.
So for me, the way that I work with this is I have the kind of capital T truth. The only one for me is like this statement of existence that we've been trying to pin down for this whole conversation. And maybe that's the only thing that I can be sure of. But then there's a set of assumptions that I choose to live my life based around, basically because it's more enjoyable that way, and it seems like I don't have strong reason to believe that they're not true. Assumptions like I actually exist in human form, other humans actually exist, other people actually have minds, my senses, generally speaking, conform to some kind of external reality that's usually consistent. But I'm more willing to doubt those things. And then there's other truths that are kind of stacked on top of that. And there's like different ways that you can kind of stack up like how likely something actually is to be true. Like how many people believe it? What was their methodology? Are they following reason? I guess all the mathematical reasoning tools are really like back in my axioms of truth also. So there's different layers, like have I observed it myself? If I haven't observed it myself, have people who I trust observed it? Okay, how many? Okay, like how much do I actually trust that they're using good reasoning skills to detect whether or not it's true? There's a lot of those kinds of factors.
Yeah, so I think you draw an important distinction there, which is that some of your beliefs or some of your axioms are consciously chosen. And I think everybody goes through a process as they're going from being a child to being an adult of essentially questioning all of the unconscious axioms, so questioning all of the things that seem to underpin their reality.
We wish everybody would, but I don't think everybody goes through that.
Well, I think everybody goes through some kind of disillusionment. I don't think everybody stays in like the exact same childish reality that, sure, their parents and society, always taught them. Maybe they do, maybe there are some people who are just almost literally sheep, they're like, here's what society and my parents taught me, so that's what's true, and they never question any of those things. And, so that person has, a conscious reality, which is not very sophisticated because they've never gone through and questioned why they actually believe these unconscious axioms. But then I think once you go through that process, you reach sort of a higher level of enlightenment.
I generally agree with that perspective, but I would also say that if you spend all of your time questioning assumptions, because there seem to be infinite amounts of assumptions that you could question if you keep digging and digging and digging, you will never really accomplish anything because it will just consume your whole life.
Well,
so
I think
at some point there's a balance to be had where you choose some assumptions to live by in order to be able to like achieve concrete things in the world. I guess if you choose to believe in concrete things and choose to value achievement.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if one of your axioms is I exist and, you know, somehow either I define or I derive the truth that I'm a human being with a limited lifespan, eventually you come to the conclusion that, okay, well, actually time is short. And so I don't have infinite time to explore all these anomalies and chase all of these leads, because maybe some of them are just wild goose chases. You know, basically maybe it's actually just a waste of time. So there needs to be sort of a confidence level where you draw the line and you say, okay, we'll just hold this thing to be true for now until we passively happen upon an anomaly, rather than let's spend all of our time to look for more anomalies.
And maybe it wouldn't be a waste of time. It's just, maybe it's a better use of somebody else's time, because if you want to question every single possible anomaly, then you're going to be completely spread out.
That's where it's hard to avoid this kind of like subjectivism of like, everyone can just do whatever they want to, because it's hard to really motivate the idea on the basis we've discussed that any set of assumptions is any less arbitrary than any other set of assumptions. Like, why should I be like assuming, like, why should one of my axioms be that a belief without contradiction is better than a belief with contradiction? Like, why shouldn't I embrace contradiction?
So Pritchard talks about this, even though I disagreed with his specific conclusion. His general conclusion is that, well, some forms of truth are clearly better than other forms of truth or some belief systems are better than other belief systems because some belief systems lead to me being happy and some belief systems lead to me not being happy. So obviously that has to be an axiom. like you have to trust your experience of things in order to believe that. But
I would say something similar. I think that you need to choose your values and then align your axioms to those values. Arguing that some values are better than others is very difficult, but there seem to be some that are kind of biologically ingrained in us.
Well, and I think what's important to note, which Pritchard completely ignores, is that, you know, my belief system and your belief system don't need to be the same in order for us both to be happy. And actually, it's probably likely that our two belief systems have lots of differences. And it may be somehow very true that I actually have to believe something different from you in order to maximize my happiness.
My belief system might make it impossible for you to be happy. Like, what if my belief system is that your dog is an embodiment of Satan and I decide to kill your dog?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that might lead to you being happier, but it certainly wouldn't lead to me being happy. but that's not your belief system and my belief system being, well, okay, you're right.
Yeah,
okay, I see. So that's a difference in realities, which leads to one party being less happy. Sure. But that's not because my vision of reality is wrong. It's because your vision of reality is wrong.
Well, how do we know? Maybe I'm the one that's right and you're the one that's wrong.
True.
We can only
so you're right. We can definitely have conflicting realities. That is certainly true.
It's tricky. It's my view that we can only approximate knowledge. So it is possible that like your seemingly wacky view that my dog is Satan's spawn is wrong, or is actually the correct view, and like my more conventional view is wrong. But like, there's not a lot of reason to believe that. It's tough though. Like it's really hard, especially if us three can't even agree on if existence exists if we get down to it. But generally day to day, we operate on certain assumptions, and like there seems to be like some not completely universal, but like semi-common universal values about like how knowledge can be attained. But yeah, if we fundamentally disagree, it's tough, and we can approximate knowledge, but I don't think that I could necessarily convince a person who thought that my dog was Satan's spawn that my dog is not Satan's spawn.
Well, I think this is where, like, you know, in some ways things need to transcend rationality a bit. Like, this is where Kierkegaard would probably point out, like, the reason you think your dog isn't Satan's spawn probably isn't because you've like reasoned from first principles. It's because you love your dog, and that's all the argument you need. And at a certain point, like, a lot of what we believe isn't so much based on rationality, it's based on emotion and intuition, like Chris talked about earlier.
Yeah, but it's very difficult to argue against someone else's emotion and intuition. You can't, well, okay, yeah.
Well, especially because your reality is based on your emotion and intuition.
Yeah, you can't, and it's very difficult to logic someone out of an emotional and intuitive belief.
I mean,
you would have to manipulate their emotion.
I think the best you can hope to achieve is to convince as many other people as possible that your emotions and intuition are correct while the other person's are not correct.
And I mean, I think this is where, I think you guys alluded to this a minute ago. Another axiom you could take on could be that if a belief is very common or universal, or if there's an emotion or an intuition that happens to be universal, and it's more likely to be true or to be pointing towards some kind of truth.
Yeah. And I would say that's an axiom that sort of requires some faith, but I would also say that I believe it and act as though it's true.
I do in some circumstances. Like there's a lot of areas where I think that general society is very wrong. Like that's one factor of many that I would look at to maybe indicate that something is pointing towards some truth, but it's very fallible.
But there's a difference also between something being common on a societal level and being common on a species level. Like, if there's something that all humans experience in common, that's different from, you know, something that all Canadians experience in common or something, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. This gets really tricky, because now I feel like we're almost getting into discussions not only about like belief systems, but also about like a little bit about values and ethics, and like why should one thing be valued over another, and that's a very deep place to dive.
Okay.
Yeah, and this conversation can continue like in all sorts of different directions.
We could talk about if science is true, and
we could talk about how Jordan Peterson talks about how actions come before sort of conscious explanations for those actions. First come the actions, right? And then after they've been working for a while, then we come up with an explanation for why does that action work.
That's what Hume is saying. That was like kind of Hume's point, is he basically said that like, you don't touch the fire because the fire is hot. You learn the fire is hot and you stop touching the fire. And then you try to explain to other people a reason why they shouldn't touch the fire.
Yeah. So maybe it's a true reason, or, you know, maybe it's not. All right. Yeah. I think that conversation went somewhere. I had my doubts, as I do about everything.
Thanks everyone for joining us on this journey into skepticism. Like, subscribe, follow, all that, and we'll see you next week.